Hello and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program and we focus on this particular question. Why is our political system so dysfunctional and polarized? And most importantly, how are we going to fix the system? So in every show we try and pick a topic that deals with dysfunction or polarization. We talk about solution sets. This is the one and only election recap show that we're going to do this year. I figure not only were you tired of the election by the time we actually had the election, but you're now already tired of all the analysis of the election, who won, why they won, you know, Trump this, Trump that, etc. We're going to focus on a very narrow topic today, but it's a very special and important narrow topic. It's ballot measures. I don't know about everybody watching this show, but we're hosting this in Colorado. And Colorado seems to me like one of the focal points for ballot measures in every election. When I get my ballot, there's anywhere from 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, who knows how many different ballot measures there are. And I know California has always been thought of as the hotbed of ballot measures. But there's ballot measures throughout the country. And they become very, very important because in a dysfunctional political system, when people want to get something done, sometimes they have to take matters into their own hands and actually put something on the ballot and see if it flies. It's really the most basic level of democracy I think we have. Today we're going to talk to Josh. I said, we're not talking to Josh today. We're talking to Ryan today, Byrne, from Ballotpedia. As you'll also recall, Ballotpedia is just an amazing friend of ours. It's the best political website there is. And if you want to know anything about politics, you're going to go to ballotpedia.org. Ryan is on the team that handles the reporting of ballot measures. He works with Josh Altek, who's not with us today. I've said that. And we're going to drill down with Ryan and talk about ballot measures and also get to some of my favorite topics, which include redistricting. So without any further ado, Ryan Byrne. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you for having us.
And Ryan, you are a rookie today. I don't know if you understand this, but I have a lot of people on from Ballotpedia. And when you're a Ballotpedia rookie, which you are, that means you're being tested. And then the question is, do you then elevate yourself to the status of Ballotpedia All-Star? So we'll figure that out in the course of the next 20-some minutes here.
All right.
Okay. So and as I told you, part of the test here is whether or not you're going to look at the camera. If you look to side, you will stay in rookie status. You will not make All-Star status, okay?
That's probably going to be the hardest criteria.
All right. So since we don't have Josh today, what we talked about is actually doing a little bit of ballot measure 101 because we've done a lot of shows on ballot measures, but as I said, it's a topic that's really hot right now, and I want to do a little more background. So tell us about what the world of ballot measures is at Ballotpedia, and then let's get into ballot measures themselves.
Sure. Yeah. So in 2018, there were 167 ballot measures on statewide ballots. There can also be ballot measures on local jurisdiction ballots. There are a number of different types of ballot measures. So often when people hear the term ballot measure, they think of citizens collecting signatures to put an issue on the ballot. But that's just one type of ballot measure. We refer to those as citizen initiatives. Citizens also have the power to put on measures that we call veto referendums. Veto referendum, you collect signatures to put a bill that has already been passed by the legislature and signed by the governor on the ballot, essentially a people's veto. And then there are also other types of ballot measures. State legislatures in every state, except for Delaware, require voter approval to change the state constitution. So you have to vote on constitutional amendments in order for them to go into effect in the state constitution. Sometimes legislatures also refer other issues to the ballot that are statutory. Sometimes we have special commissions, as we saw in Florida this year, that refer amendments or statutes to the ballot for voter consideration. And sometimes there's advisory issues and automatic issues. So there are a number of different ways that these questions appear on the ballot. The two most common ones are indeed through the citizen process of gathering signatures and through the legislative process.
Now, of course, since this show is about dysfunction, and I'm just old and cynical these days, I always view ballot measures that are put on by legislatures as an attempt to try and get people to come to the polls and vote for their side. So that's the cynical part of this. But I'm a lot more fascinated about the citizen part. In how many states right now can citizens actually put initiatives on the ballot?
So the states are largely concentrated out west, as well as a few in New England, a few in the Midwest, a few in the South. But it's largely concentrated out west. The number off the top of my head, I can't exactly recall it, but if you go to ballotpedia.org/2018 ballot measures, you can find the number there. It's in the upper teens.
I was actually thinking it was a little higher than that, but that's an interesting part of this, that if it is in the upper teens, that's the correct number. And since you're my expert for today, it is a correct number.
It might be the low 20s.
Yeah, but whichever it is, the point is there are still many, many states that don't allow their citizens to petition for solutions of this type. And I still find that startling.
Yeah, the majority of states do not.
In fact, I've been talking
at least at the statewide level. I think perhaps in almost every state, some local jurisdictions allow ballot measures.
Yeah, one of my pet projects now is I've been talking to people because I think we should have people try and do initiatives or whatever they need to do, change the law, so that every state can have initiatives. It seems to me that that's a very basic part of democracy. We should have that.
Exactly. In almost every state, every year, someone in a state legislature introduces a constitutional amendment to allow for that. I know in my home state of Pennsylvania, one was introduced this year. They usually don't make it out of committee to actually go to a floor vote.
And again, being cynical as I said, the reason that happens is Ballotpedia studies states for trifectas, and it studies states for the balance of the legislature. Now I don't know if Ryan, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's actually only one state in the entire country right now that has a divided legislature.
Oh.
Every state in the entire country, other than Nebraska, who's unicameral, has the House and the Senate are exactly the same. There's only one state where they're different. So what that means is, if you're in a state where the legislature is all Republican, they're not going to put ballot measures on because that means they're going to give a voice to Democrats. They don't want the Democrats to have that voice. If you're in a state where the legislature is dominated by Democrats, they're not going to allow it because they don't want Republicans to have a voice. So again, this is me being cynical, but the reality is, and this is a trick question because obviously you don't know the answer. I know the answer. There's only one state in the whole country that has one House Republican and the other House Democrat. In the entire country, I find that very interesting. But you're the ballot measure guy. You're not the trifecta guy. So let's get back to ballot measures. One of the things that you've got on the website now, which is really amazing to me, and I loved it, is the standards for readability. So what is readability to begin with?
Sure. So readability takes into account a number of variables, such as the length of words, the number of syllables, the length of sentences, things like that, kind of the more mechanical aspects of language, puts them into a formula and comes up with a number. The numbers communicate various levels that correlate with education levels. So when citizens go to read ballot questions, they face different types of language, different complexities. And at Ballotpedia, we are using a formula to calculate scores for these complexities. It spits out a number that correlates with a grade level.
Now, did you make up your own formula? Because I know there's two formulas you reference on your site. One's the, Flesch reading ease, and the other was the Flesch-Kincaid grade level. So did you make up your own?
So we didn't make these up. These were actually developed in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Defense. The reading ease one back in the 1940s, the grade level one in the mid-1970s. And both of these were developed in order to help the Department of Defense and the various military branches craft documents that and manuals that soldiers could understand. So when people went out on the field during warfare and you had to open a manual to understand something, everyone could understand it. So in order to address that, the Department of Defense adopted these. In the case of the grade level one, they actually helped develop that one specifically for soldiers to understand manuals.
So as far as I understand it, again, from reading the website, but I want you to correct me, please, if I'm wrong. One of these basically is a takeoff on the TV show that says, "Are you smarter than a fifth grader?" Because the highest possible score you can get is whether or not you've met a fifth grade standard. I think that's how one of them is. And then the other one basically gives a score that suggests at what level of education you would be at if you could read it and understand it. Is that a fair representation of the two different?
Yeah, that's a fair representation. And both of the formulas use the same exact variables. They just use different mathematical formulas to produce a number. Like you said, one is a scale that doesn't directly correlate, but roughly correlates with a grade level or something like that. And then the other one tries to assign a specific grade level.
Okay, so again, my reading of this is that the one that I'm calling "Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader?" the highest score you can get, I think, is 100, and you can get 100 if you're as smart as a fifth grader, something like that, right? So tell the viewers here, though, if 100 is the highest score, and that means, you know, a fifth grader would get it, what kind of scores normally come in on these things?
So the average score, and if we use the grade level formula, just because I think unless people go to Ballotpedia's website, and by the way, if you want to look at this readability report, it's ballotpedia.org/ballot measure readability scores, 2018, and we go over it all there. But just to communicate the grade level score, so the average was somewhere between 19 and 20. So that's equivalent to generally around the first couple years of a PhD.
And that means, well, but on that one, that meant you would have needed to have the equivalent of a PhD to be able to read this and understand it at an appropriate level.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, these formulas cannot account for the complexity of ideas. So, you know, in terms of people actually understanding them, they might overrepresent, they might underrepresent that grade level. But in terms of language, the complexity of language, the complexity of sentences, that's what these are trying to measure.
So people go to the polls and they go to vote, and they're looking at this thing, and if they don't have a PhD, they may not totally understand what is they're voting on, right?
That's the idea behind the readability scores. It gives some level of judgment in terms of like making sure, like I said, the Department of Defense uses it, making sure that people understand material.
I like to think I'm a fairly intelligent guy. I went to law school. I studied for the CPA exam. I did well on all those exams. But again, I get my Colorado ballot, and I open this thing, and I read it. And I will admit, I would say there's a certain portion of the time where I actually read it, and I come to a different conclusion than what I then find out I'm being asked.
Yeah, that could definitely be the case with the way the language is worded. And like I said, these formulas don't look at substance, but of course there's always the issue in the world of ballot measures with who's writing these titles or ballot questions, what is their partisan affiliation, what is their goal, and things like that. In most states, you will see that come up with citizen initiatives where the campaign declares that the writer, we often see this in California where the Attorney General writes the ballot questions. The campaign then says the ballot question itself is unfair. So that's a whole different level in terms of understanding these things as well.
So what I'm having to do these days to vote is I get the ballot. Then in Colorado, we get this pamphlet that's really nice. It tries to explain everything. I read that. Then if it's a really important one, I'll go to the website. But voting on ballot measures actually takes a lot of work.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work. And I have to say, you know, at Ballotpedia, we try to communicate the statutory and constitutional ballot initiatives in the most simple language as possible. But even using the most simple language as possible sometimes means that we're writing very, very long explanations because there's often a lot of facets to a ballot measure. So
you've been doing this off and on for 5 or 6 years. Do you think you're seeing an improvement in readability, or it's just kind of, you know, mush, it stays mush?
Yeah, so I don't think there's necessarily been an improvement. There have been studies. There was a study in the late 90s that also looked at this, and the scores are still kind of similar. We haven't really seen an improvement. We haven't really seen things getting worse. Similar styles of language are still being used.
Because the thing about ballot initiatives, and particularly I like to focus on the one that citizens initiate, there's a petition process. So you have to have your language ready to go to petition. And once you've gone to petition, you're not changing your language. So it's very dissimilar to legislation, where someone may introduce legislation, they change it, it gets amended, you know, it passes the House of Representatives, it goes to the Senate, it gets amended. Legislation has changes in wording, you know, throughout. Whereas ballot measures, the minute you lock in on your petitions and your wording, and that's signed off on, you're done, right? That's all you get.
In terms of the initiatives statutory or constitutional language itself, yes. Sometimes with ballot questions, it's not the petitioners who are writing them. In very few cases, the petitioners actually write them. It's usually a different individual or group, whether it's a state board or an attorney general. In California, this is a really interesting thing because it's rather new. You're actually allowed to amend your ballot initiative within a certain number of days after you file it, and you can get some feedback from the state and from any other citizens that aren't affiliated with you. They can provide their input as well, and then you can amend your initiative. So in California, you can do that now, but you still have a set time period. You can't amend it halfway to the election. You have so many days from the day you file it.
So let's talk about topics. You said there was 160 or so this year, which is a fairly standard number. In fact, maybe a little lower than what we've seen in recent elections, correct?
Sure, yeah. So there were a number of hot topic areas this year. There were some that were that are typically hot topics almost every year. Minimum wage, though we didn't see as many minimum wage initiatives this year. It was just Arkansas and Missouri versus in 2006 when we saw it in a few more states than that. Marijuana was a hot topic, but once again, like minimum wage, there weren't as many this year. Michigan was the big one, and there was medical marijuana measures in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Utah, where those all passed as well. Some of the more the uniquer areas for 2018, though, they're not necessarily topics that only have occurred in 2018, but we saw a bit of an uptick in them. We saw a good number of redistricting ballot initiatives. We saw a number of ballot measures related to state energy policies. Medicaid expansion was another kind of hot topic this year, as well as a number of ballot initiatives that also dealt with restricting taxes, specifically restricting increasing taxes or putting caps on taxes, things like that. But redistricting was definitely an area that got, perhaps of all the issues, we saw the most coverage of it in the media.
And this again goes back to my cynical nature here. You point out there's a lot of initiatives dealing with Medicaid expansion. So my guess, and we won't have time for this, but my guess is those are mostly going to be in states that lean Democratic, or where the Democrats want to use that to get people to turn out to vote, because that is a topic that leans more Democratic. And in the states where they want to reduce taxes or lock in taxes, those are usually states where they're trying to drive Republican turnout. My particular fascination, though, and you said the magic word, is redistricting. Because on my show, I talk about the fact that I think of all the evils in our system, redistricting is as evil as anything. To me, it's worse than campaign finance reform. So talk a little bit about redistricting. First of all, what is redistricting in the sense of a ballot initiative? When you say that, what are we talking about here?
So with a ballot initiative, it can be very broad, right? So basically, it's anything that's amending the redistricting process in a state. That can be congressional or state legislative. There are a wide field of potential reforms that can be made to the process. So when I say initiative, redistricting initiative, I mean that very broadly. I can get into some of the more specifics with the initiatives this year. Some of them created commissions. Some of them created new criteria that the legislature needs to consider. There was a very unique one in Missouri. So kind of a field of topics dealing with that process.
All right, again, my viewers know how I feel about this topic, the fact that legislators traditionally draw the maps. So the phrase is, and I think that President Obama coined this, the voters, the legislators get to choose who gets to vote for them. They're picking who's going to vote for them, and they're going to pick the people that are going to help them win. So that's the redistricting game. So when you say that in Missouri there was a fairly interesting one, what were the people in Missouri doing?
So in Missouri, they passed a ballot initiative, Amendment 1. The campaign behind Amendment 1 called it the Clean Missouri Amendment. It broadly dealt with issues that the campaign considered as relevant to state legislative ethics. So it dealt with lobbying laws, campaign finance laws, as well as state legislative redistricting. So the one in Missouri actually created a new position that we haven't seen in any other state called the state demographer. So in other states where the legislature no longer is involved in redistricting, they often have commissions. In Missouri, they will have a position called the state demographer. It's an individual who will then draw the maps and submit them to existing political committees that then will decide whether they want to amend it or not. The rules for that are pretty high, so there's a substantial chance that the demographer's map gets enacted by default because these commissions cannot come to an agreement on what to do with the demographer's map. The demographer will also need to consider two new variables that we haven't really seen in any other states. In Missouri, they're specifically referred to as partisan fairness and competitiveness. So those take into account the election results in a number of different types of statewide elections, gubernatorial, U.S. Senate, as well as the presidential election, calculate what the percents were in terms of the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate, use a formula, then come out with this calculation for how competitive a district is. So the demographer will need to consider that in the formulation. Like I said, that only addresses state legislative. It does not address congressional districts. So that will kick in following currently it goes into effect tomorrow. But of course, the first time this will be utilized will be following the 2020 U.S. Census.
And how does the demographer get chosen?
So the demographer must meet a number of criteria. The criteria are going to be mostly determined by the state auditor. So obviously that list of criteria will be developed in the coming year or two. And then people can apply for this job. A certain number are randomly selected, and then that list is given to the state legislative leaders, the House and Senate Democratic leader, the House and Senate Republican leader, or whichever parties in the future are the top two largest parties in the legislature. And then they have a striking process. So they each get to strike a certain number from this list. And then the final list, which is now shorter, goes back to the auditor, who then randomly picks one.
All fascinating stuff, and I was so happy to see that this year so many redistricting measures passed. Obviously, we passed a couple in my state of Colorado, and it'd be interesting to see where they go. And we've got to keep our eye on this demographer thing. So before we let you go, let's talk a little bit about the money here, because ballot measures can get very, very expensive. We talk about campaign finance reform and other things. On your website, you guys focus on the top 10 most expensive ballot measures in the country, and I think those 10 alone, there was over $500 million spent. So these are big dollar items. And I also note that of the top 10 measures where the most money was spent, the side that spent the most money won every time. So this is a big money game.
That is true. So $1.13 billion were raised this year for ballot measures. That number could still be a bit higher because there are still a number of post-election campaign finance reports that need to be filed. Some of them go as late, the filing dates are as late as January 30th of next year. So we won't have an exact number until then. But it probably won't increase a ton more because most of these covered through Election Day. So yes, we're currently at $1.13 billion. The top 10, the side with the most money won. The top 10 included things like California Proposition 8, which was a really interesting conflict. I know we're running low on time, so I won't get into the details on that. But it pitted a labor union against dialysis companies, and a lot of money was spent. The dialysis companies spent $111.5 million, and they won that one. The second most expensive one was also in California, which dealt with rent control. In that case, it was this organization called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which has backed a number of housing and medical-related ballot initiatives versus a bunch of apartment associations.
And the thing about money for ballot initiatives is you don't always have the same limitations you would have for a campaign for a candidate, an individual candidate. And I don't know if we're going to get to the point where we're going to see some limitations on that, but I think that's going to have to be a topic.
Yeah, so there's actually a Supreme Court ruling on this, and I don't know the details of it, from a couple decades back, dealing with ballot initiatives, and the idea with certain campaign finance limitations being unconstitutional, because the court came down with the conclusion that ballot measures cannot be corrupted in the same way that a candidate can. So yes, many states, due to that ruling, as well as other factors, do not have many limitations on campaign finance for ballot measures.
Well, Ryan, this is a fascinating area, and thank you for your time. Once again, tell our viewers how they can find information on Ballotpedia and get better educated and learn more about this.
Sure, yeah. So you can visit Ballotpedia at ballotpedia.org, and you can learn more about ballot measures by going to ballotpedia.org. In the case of 2018 measures, ballotpedia.org/2018 ballot measures. You can also start learning about 2019 and 2020 because we're already on our way to covering those by going to ballotpedia.org/2019 ballot measures and ballotpedia.org/2020 ballot measures. And from those pages, you will find links to all that will help you go to all sorts of pages dealing with the world of ballot measures.
Ryan, you've been a great guest, and I think you are clearly at the level of Ballotpedia All-Star.
I think I missed the green dot a few times, but
the truth
most of the time I stuck with it.
Truth is that everybody at Ballotpedia is an all-star, and that's why you're our favorite website. So thanks for being with us.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for watching today's show. I'm fascinated by ballot measures. They're becoming more important every year because, again, we live in a dysfunctional political world, and some people can't wait for the legislatures to solve a problem. They go out and try and solve it on their own, and they go through the petition process, get things on the ballot. It's still fascinating to me that we don't have this capability in every state, although, I don't know, maybe things can get run amok. I know here in Colorado, sometimes I think there's way too many initiatives on the ballot, and they need to be culled a little more. I don't have that answer. But I want you thinking about it, and if there's an issue that's important to you, I can guarantee you it's being talked about right now if you're in one of those states, and you should try and get involved. One of the things we try and do on this show is not only educate you and bring on guests like Ryan to educate you about what's going on, we want you to get involved. At the end of the day, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.